3B, Principles of Fitness Testing. One of my favorite sections. I'm a huge fan of fitness testing. I believe that it should be done. I think it should be done a lot more than it is. Uh, it's just, to me, it's a big area of interest of mine, and I hope that you do fitness testing in your careers, and at least do it on yourself. So, what's the purpose of a fitness test? It's health screening. So, you can get a lot of health based information. I had an issue with my back. I had nerve damage associated with it, and it caused me to have a decreased strength in my quad. One of the things that I did a leg extension with my right leg, and I was able to lift whatever amount of weight. But when I tried to do it with my left leg, I could only lift about half of that. So it gave me an idea, a real true uh, value. Now, do the orthopedic doctors do this? Do the neurologists do this? No, but I was able to see, okay, I've got half the level of strength in my left leg as I do in my right leg due to this back issue. So uh, you know that it's not just doing it for the purpose of exercise prescription, but there's a very strong health component going on there as well. Developing fitness profiles. Uh, uh, that kind of goes together with health screening. See what your identify strengths and weaknesses. So they kind of all go together. Setting goals. So when you're trying to set a goal, where's your starting point, and trying to go from there. It's very important in the exercise prescription. And evaluate progress. And evaluating progress is huge. I have a very strong belief that you should do exercise testing. And one of the main reasons you should do exercise testing is to see, is what you're doing working? So if you do, and are you capturing that somehow? So if you're doing an aerobic program or running program, are people becoming more fit? Well, how do you determine that they become more fit? And there's a lot of different ways you could potentially do that. Some of them are relatively low tech. Is your performance getting better? And some are still relatively low tech, but give you just better data. Something like the aerobic exercise tests we're doing in lab, as well as the field testing that we're doing in lab, are pretty good ways that are pretty easy to do that will help you figure out how you're doing aerobically. We'll go through some of the different measures, in a bit here. So the testing order, essentially with the testing order, you got kind of two things going on. One is a fatigue factor. You don't want the individual to be fatigued from one test to another. So you want to keep that into consideration. And the other thing that's going to be an issue is the ick factor. So if you do a cardiorespiratory endurance test, how does that person look when they're done? How does that person feel when they're done? So you got practical issues there. Generally, you're going to feel tired and you're going to be sweaty. So for you to do body composition measures, namely skin fold measures on somebody who's glistening, on somebody who's slick, it's just going to be gross, as well as it's going to be difficult to be able to complete the measures because your fingers are just going to be sliding all over the place because of all the sweat. And did I say it's gross? So, you've got those issues going on with testing order. When I taught an exercise testing class, my thought process was 2 1-hour sessions. And if you're personal training, to take 2 1-hour sessions to do exercise testing is reasonable. If you're in different settings, that might not be reasonable. If you're in a corporate wellness setting, you're dealing with large groups of people, to do one-on-one testing for 2 1-hour sessions, you're just not going to be able to do it. So you're going to have to take some of those things into consideration. But generally, you're looking at what's the level of fatigue and what's the ick factor. So the quality of the test, how valid is the test, how reliable is the test. So validity is that you're getting the value represents the true value that it should. So like so one measure that's you could argue about the validity is going to be body mass index. So if you're looking at somebody that's muscular, their body mass index may be high, but they're still lean and of appropriate weight. So that's not a really valid measure for body composition in that situation. But it's reliable because every time you have the person stand on a stadiometer, I think that's what it's called, to measure your height, that should be consistent. And every time you measure a person's weight, that should be relatively consistent. Especially it's going to be consistent from one person to the other. So that's going to be good. So it's very reliable. You get the same results basically every time. Objective, is it up to your opinion or is it subjective? So things like form might be a little bit more subjective. Something like a body mass index is going to be objective. There's no real wiggle room. Nothing's up to the individual completing the testing. So here's some of the different components of fitness, and then some of the different things that are done for it. Cardiorespiratory endurance, the best thing is to have the mask and measure the expired gases, the VO2 max test. But you could also do a maximal graded exercise test, which is what we're going to do in the lab. You could do submaximal graded exercise testing. You could also do a field test, which we'll also do in the lab. And some of these things, we'll see this. It'll be a consistent theme throughout the term. There's this thing called technology, and things are advancing. So with the graded exercise test, a lot of the tests that you see in your books are going to be something like a bike test. They'll talk about the Monarch bike test. Well, nobody uses a Monarch bike anymore. But back in the day, the treadmills were enormous, cost a huge amount of money. They were a very rare commodity. So most of the treadmill tests that you see are either directed towards the high-end athlete or they're directed to a clinical disease population. So you're either seeing it in an exercise physiology lab or you're seeing it in a hospital-based setting. Two places where people will have the means to do it. Now, treadmills are a dime a dozen, and the protocols that are developed by others that you see in your textbook, they don't really address the fact that we have a ton of treadmills, and how do we develop protocols that will work for the entire population? So, there's those types of things that you see that are developing and new, and adjustments will be made. There's various predictions. Generally, there is a level of error, but the error is not too bad, and a lot of times with all of this, you're kind of trying to get a general area and ballpark. To know a specific value is nice, but to characterize an individual is important. Are their values good? Are they elite? Is this a strength or a deficiency? What's going on there? So body composition, we're looking at a percent body fat. You've got the gold standards of the underwater weighing, the dual X-ray absorptiometry, otherwise known as DEXA. You have the air plasmography, which is the BOD-POD. You have different things that are considered gold standards, the best out there. Then you have some measures that are cheaper, not as accurate, but still provide you with good information. The bioelectrical impedance, skin fold measures, anthropometry. One of the things that's new that Mr. Stern was talking about was body volume. I haven't really seen. There's a app on the iPad. I haven't looked at it. You take a picture, and I guess it does some assessments based on that picture. That might show some promise. I think it definitely has potential to do a better job than a body mass index and be relatively cheap and easy to use. So there's things again that are developing, which may change some of this. Muscular strength, the 1 rep max measure. I think that's the best measure out there. It's relatively low risk of injury. People think it's a high risk of injury, but the risk is relatively low. The issue is that if you're sedentary, the Golgi tendon organs that mechanism will be fairly strong. So if the muscles contract a lot, it's going to put pressure, stress on the tendons. That's going to send a message back spine, sends a message back to the muscle to relax. So you're not able to engage as much of the muscle mass as if you were regularly doing resistance training. So technically the risk is greater for people that do a lot of resistance training, and especially I think the greatest risk is for the individual that did a lot of resistance training, has not done any resistance training for whatever reason, and is now doing a 1 rep max test. They still have the knowledge and some level of muscle memory potentially, where they're able to get more of the muscle to contract to do the lift, and that can cause muscle tears and things like that. But generally, if you use some sense and take some precautions, the risk should be low. I've never had an issue. I did a lot of 1 rep max testing in previous years and never had an issue with it. So, there's also equations and submax. So you do a 2 to 10 rep max and then put it into an equation to see what the potential 1 rep max would be. Bone strength, that is also measured through the dual X-ray absorptiometry. Ironically, when people do bone strength or bone mineral density measures, especially the older women, they don't really do the body. They don't really get the body comp result, which I think is sad, because those individuals could benefit from knowing what their body composition is. They might not be heavy. Osteoporosis affects more frail women, people that are skinny, than it does obese women. But for those individuals that they might not have a whole lot of muscle mass. So I kind of figure out, okay, how much muscle mass do they have? How much fat mass do they have? What kind of things do we need to do? Typically, when you do the testing, all they will measure is bone mineral density when you're doing it for your grandmother or grandparents or whatever. Flexibility, you have the X-ray. I don't know how much that's used, but really the goniometry. So it measures joint angles. That's a good measure, and that's really the best measure if you're looking at those sorts of things. You have balance testing. You have various different ways you can look at balance. One thing that's not looked at here, which we'll talk about later, is the functional movement screen. That's a good assessment of movement. There's different things out there. Different people have developed different things. But the functional movement screen, especially for the population that we work with, I feel is very appropriate and good to figure out, okay, is there flexibility okay? Is there a deficit somewhere? As well as how is their balance and neuromotor function? What makes a good prediction equation? Who cares? A good prediction equation is important, but really you will just deal with the prediction equation, and hopefully it's good. You're not really going to be developing a prediction equation. Post-test instructions to the client, directions and arrangements, or pre-test, to get to the facility. We talked about some of this before. Clothing, exercise, dietary restrictions. We talked about that in the previous section. Test administration, use standardized procedures. You've got kind of two things going on there. So you can either individualize the test for the person. And if you're developing an exercise prescription, you might want to individualize everything. But from the perspective of comparing one person to another, it's helpful to have standardized procedures where every subject you work with does relatively the same thing. So then that way it's easy to compare, okay, this individual and another individual, because they both did the same thing. If you do a push-up test and you do a 1 rep max bench press, you've done two different exercises, and how do you compare one to the other? It's kind of difficult. So if you standardize it and say, okay, everybody's going to do a push-up test, then you can compare the two individuals much better. There's age and gender specific norms. Avoid technical jargon. And again, what I say is, use the technical jargon, but then make sure that you use something that the individual can also understand and relate to. Be positive and supportive. That's it.